Hi, this is Carolyn Bond, and I'd like to thank Rebecca Siegel and the Owen County Book Fair for having this innovative book fair that we can all enjoy and be safe and healthy at home. I write historical fiction. I've written for a long time, actually. I've started writing historical fiction really just in about the last 5 years, but I actually started writing back in 1992. So I'm kind of old, sorry. But I started writing actually college textbooks, and Middleton Wasley Publishers in California worked with me to publish some textbooks for a vocational school that was out there. But I've always been interested in writing. As a child, I loved creative writing. It was sometimes, I had all the struggles that a person would normally have, like thinking, oh, what am I going to write about when the teacher gave the assignment? But once I got started, the thoughts would flow, and I would always come up with really crazy stories that my friends thought were funny. So I kind of got a reputation for being kind of different and kind of quirky and kind of funny. And I had crazy dreams and daydreams. I daydreamed all the time. And I loved stories of what if, especially stories about, Tom Thumb. If you were only a few inches tall, what would the world be like? If your house was upside down, what would it be like to walk around if you had to walk around on the ceilings? All sorts of crazy what if stories and what would life be like. So as I got older, I had always had a few stories in my head that I thought, oh, I want to pull out. And in 2015, I actually sat down. I was actually in grad school getting my master's degree. And as a stress reliever, I started writing. I enjoyed reading to get lost in another world, but writing gave me a new outlet where I could not only experience a new world, but I could create it every step I went in front of me. I was creating the world as I went, and it was so engaging that it really kind of helped me to deal with the stress of being in grad school and having kids. But I started writing at that point. My first novel was Between Time. Between Time was kind of an alternate world, guardian angel type of fictional story. It was something I had thought about for a long time, and it does kind of have its own little cult following. But I also figured out that that genre isn't quite as popular in the mainstream. So tweaking things, I thought, well, I'll try my hand at romance. I've never really been a person who thought, oh yeah, I can write romance. But I thought I could do this, and of course I interweave and woven into it. Sorry, my cat's going nuts over there, but the time travel factor. And so I had my crazy along with the romance, and so I really enjoyed that. So the first romance story that I wrote was Bluegrass Blush, this book. And Bluegrass Blush came out in 2018, and it's a story of a woman who goes back in time, and she ends up in the Versailles area of Kentucky and meets I always call as I'm writing, a Mr. Hunky, whatever the character is. The interesting thing about this is the main character, Everly, is just your everyday woman. She's just a middle-aged woman who's working. She's not married. Her life hasn't quite gone as she would have liked it to. And through a bit of magic, she falls back in time about 100 years and actually falls into the body of someone else, a 20-year-old woman. So she has all of the wisdom of a 35-year-old professional, except now she can go back and do some of the things that she kind of wished she would have done when she was younger, and to have the romance that she would have liked, but she was so focused on her career and maybe a little too shy. And so now she's able to enjoy that to some extent and finds romance. All of my stories in this series, the Steam Through Time series, I'm working on the third one now, focus on a modern woman who's very intelligent. And so through a twist of magic, she finds herself back in time. And Everly in this one, she finds herself in 1888. So I get to do the historical fiction part where I get to explore Victorian era and all of the social aspects of that. So that's kind of one thing that I think is a little different with my books. I do really enjoy the sociological side of it. My undergrad was in sociology and psychology. I ended up going into human resources, and then later my master's was in teaching. So I've taught elementary school, and actually now I'm back in human resources again. But I really enjoyed the psychological aspect of how people deal when they find themselves in a particular construct of an institution, whether it be school or work or whatever. And so going back into the 1880s, I get to see how my characters with modern minds of modern independent women deal with the Victorian era and the tight constructs that are there and the norm and expectations that go on. And so they end up actually making some pretty revolutionary changes. And since they're before a lot of things happen, it's kind of a wild west of whatever they want to do to make some changes. So Everly actually makes some significant changes in the lives of a very vulnerable population, which you'll find out in the story. But it's individuals with developmental disabilities. So she's actually a lawyer for special needs individuals, and making sure that the workplace is accommodating. So she takes that with her in the past. So okay, so my next book in the series is Steam Over Stephensport, and it's set in Stephensport, Kentucky, which is just downriver from Louisville. It's on the Ohio River. Very small community. What intrigued me most about Stephensport was, well, my family is from there, so I have ancestral heritage from that area, and I have several people, buried in the cemeteries there. And so, of course, we would go as a family and go to the cemetery and, decorate the graves, that sort of thing. But as I dug into the history, because I personally had never lived there, I learned that actually Stephensport in the late 1800s was a very busy community. There was a lot of paddle wheel steamboat traffic that went past. There was a dock where goods would be loaded and unloaded. The railroad went through that area. It was new with westward expansion. And there was actually an area where the labor area for the railroad was there, where they would work on the railroad. So a lot of people moved to that area, and it built up. It had the main street was pretty vibrant with banks and mercantiles and a restaurant and machine iron workers. There was a lot of industry in that area. And it was very busy. It was a very up-and-coming community. And then due to some changes, the railroad actually moved their work area to Hardinsburg, so it was not on the river. Also, there were some floods and fires in the early 1900s. And within a period of about, if you started 1880, within about 20 to 30 years, Stephensport lost a huge amount of population and industry. And now when you drive down the street, you would never know that all that was there. It is a sleepy hamlet, really kind people, a lot of farmers, a lot of people who work in Hardinsburg or maybe drive further for work. There's not a lot of industry in the area. The only other than a couple of churches and the post office and the fire department, that's pretty much all of the, Main Street front door businesses you would see going down the road there. So it's very different now. So for me, of course, my imagination takes over, and I think, wow, if someone from 1880 were transported to the future time, they would be so surprised to see how different the community looks from what they knew, and vice versa. So, of course, there goes my daydreaming. I always start off with a book with lots of daydreaming of what if. And so I have a woman from Kentucky who goes to Stephensport to visit her grandmother's grave, and through a little bit of magic, ends up going back to 1889. And when she goes there, she actually meets her ancestors who lived there at the time. She also meets Evan, who is a Scottish immigrant who's working on a farm there. It's very common to have a lot of immigrants that were farmers that were working in the area. Kentucky has a very large Scots-Irish ancestry. And so, of course, they have a romance, and she is actually a teacher. She's an educator, And so, they need a new teacher. So she starts teaching the local children and quickly learns that there's a huge disparity in the late 1800s for how boys and girls are educated. Boys are educated in reading and mathematics and science, where the girls are basically just taught enough of how to write their name, maybe read a few Bible passages, and that's all they need because they're going to be at home being homemakers and having children. So, of course, the modern woman that she is, that is, appalling to her. So she sets about to make some changes to education in that era. So it's kind of a fun little book. If you like time travel, she actually goes forward and backward a couple of times, and one of our villain characters in the story ends up in the present day, and so that's kind of shocking to him too. So it's kind of a fun time travel story with the sociological side and the romance. Gotta have the romance in there. And I will say that my romances are clean romances. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I wouldn't have any trouble with her reading any of my romances. It's very, I guess you would say, PG-13. So there's nothing really inappropriate in it. The lights go out before anything actually, too risque happens. So I couldn't write anything that my kids or my mom couldn't read without me getting terribly embarrassed. That doesn't mean that it isn't pretty spicy. It's a fun read. But it's kind of on the level of maybe a Harlequin romance. So it's definitely something that you wouldn't worry too much about, that you could be okay reading and not be surprised or taken by surprise by anything. So the next story in the series that I'm working on, that's kind of an interesting plot twist for me as a writer. The next one coming is called Bridge in the Mist, and it is set in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. So Bridge in the Mist is a very different story than the others. It still has the romance, it still has the time travel. It's set in 1890. So our main character in this story is a vaccine biologist, and I'm making this video right now at the end of April in 2020. So we're all dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. I started writing this story about a year and a half ago. I've had a lot going on, so that I've gotten a little bit behind in my writing. But I started writing this story long before coronavirus was even known. And the story actually goes back to 1890, which there was a global pandemic, and that's a key component of the story. The Russian flu became a pandemic in 1890, started in Russia, spread to Europe, and eventually to the United States and even to Kentucky. The Russian flu was a precursor to the Spanish flu, and they actually think that the virus that started the Russian flu with the H1N1 virus was the same virus as the Spanish flu, and that the people who were alive in 1890, that's why it hit the younger people worse and for the Spanish flu, because the younger people didn't have the immunity. The older people had a small amount of immunity before the virus mutated to some degree. So our heroine goes back to 1890, but she's actually pulled back in time by a woman who is a newlywed. She'd been married for about a year, and to a man who is a master distiller. Okay, so in Bridge in the Mist, our main character, Rain, the vaccine biologist, is actually pulled back in time through magic again by another woman, Eleonora, who's married to Fletcher. Eleonora and Fletcher had been married for about a year, and the Russian flu makes its way to Kentucky and actually takes Fletcher. And so Eleanor is so heartbroken that she calls. She said, if we just had more time, if it were 100 years in the future, I'm sure they could figure out a way to defeat this virus. And through her own yearning of her heart with the magic, she is able to pull a vaccine biologist back into time to 1890. into her own, her previous self's body. So here Rain finds herself looking like Eleonora. Fletcher doesn't realize that there's any difference, except Rain knows she's different. And so she begins the process of trying to mitigate the effects of the Russian flu, specifically with how it is going to handle Fletcher. She knows it's coming, and so she uses all of her skills to try to save him. So in the process, of course, she falls in love with Fletcher. And then, you got to work out all the quirks of how exactly is this going to end. Can it change time? Can Eleonora go back? Does Rain actually want to go back to her present time? So I was in the midst of all of this, and my vaccine biologist was creating her vaccine with using her Victorian tools that she could compile, and the coronavirus hit. So it's been very different. Up until that time, I had been imagining what it would be like to be in a pandemic and how things would be different. And now, all the research I had done months and months of research of how vaccines work, how viruses work. And basically, at this point, every American knows just as much as I had gleaned through a year's worth of research trying to find it. So I'm having to kind of go back and tweak this because the current time that Rain came from, last year, there was no global pandemic. And at this point, if she goes back from the current time, she is going back in the midst of a global pandemic herself. So that's going to alter my story a bit. So I am reworking some things. I think it'll still be great. It's just kind of thrown my story topsy-turvy because of what's going on in current events. And I guess that just happens in writing. I mean, we got to kind of go with the flow. So I don't really, let's see, I'm trying to think of any other questions I can answer. I think I've pretty much answered it all. But, So, to wrap this up, I guess I would say that if you enjoy a little romance, a little science fiction time travel, time travel light, it's not too much in the science fiction-y era, with a really interesting story of how people deal with their surroundings, whether it's the current time or the past, I think you would really enjoy my books. They do pretty well. I go through an independent publisher. I am actually an extremely impatient person, so I cannot even deal with traditional publishing. I deal with an independent publisher that's really good to me called Timepiece Trace. And so, my books are of good quality. They've been edited. They do well on Amazon. They're available on Amazon either as a paperback version that I've shown you, that the couple of copies. If you like a traditional book, you can hold it in your hand, but it's also available as an ebook either way. And Amazon sometimes does specials where you can download it for free for 5 days, so that may be an option if you watch it as well. But I encourage you to read them and reach out to me. I also have a blog site that I do some short stories on now and then at carolynbondwriter.com. And you can also find access to the books available through there as well. And email me and message me what you think. Every writer wants to know, did you like them? Hopefully, I guess if you didn't like them, be nice about it. But it does really help to hear when somebody reads the book and they liked it. That makes me feel good. I write because I enjoy it. I like getting lost in my books. But yeah, it's certainly a real thrill when somebody else enjoys them too. So, but thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you listening and happy reading. Thank you.